Carl Jung spent decades studying the darkest corners of the human mind. He documented psychosis, shadow, archetypes, and the hidden machinery of the unconscious. But there was one pattern he returned to again and again, one so disturbing, so deeply uncomfortable, that it resists easy naming. Jungian analysts today describe it as the total dissolution of the persona, the collapse of the constructed self, followed by a breakthrough into what Jung called individuation. He never called it comfortable. He never called it safe. But he did call it necessary. And what made it truly terrifying was this. It was not the end of the person. It was the beginning. Jung believed that the kindest, most perceptive people, the ones who absorbed everyone else's pain, who saw through every mask, who held the emotional weight of entire families and systems, were not gentle souls who had been broken by the world. They were individuals of extraordinary psychological depth, and that depth, left unintegrated, would eventually demand to be reckoned with. What you are about to discover is not a comfortable idea. It challenges everything we think we know about sensitivity, about suffering, and about what it means to finally reach a limit. Because Jung found that the people who collapsed the most completely were not the weakest. They were the ones who had been paying attention, silently, carefully, for years. So what happens when a mind can no longer ignore the truth it has been secretly gathering for decades? What happens when perception finally overwhelms the need to believe the best in people? Jung spent his career mapping that territory, and what he found will change the way you see yourself and everyone around you. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the abaissement du niveau mental, a French phrase meaning the lowering of the mental level. In his clinical observations, this state described a kind of psychic exhaustion where the conscious mind's defenses weaken and unconscious contents rush to the surface. For most people, this looks like a breakdown, but Jung identified a specific type of individual for whom this process unfolded differently, not as collapse into chaos, but as collapse into terrifying clarity. He described these individuals as possessing a differentiated intuitive function. They were rare, introverted, intensely perceptive, processing the world at a level most people never reach. These individuals did not just feel emotions deeply. They perceived unconscious patterns in others with startling accuracy. They could walk into a room and immediately sense who was lying, who was in hidden pain, who harbored resentments they would never voice aloud. Jung documented this in his clinical notes repeatedly. He wrote that certain individuals displayed an extraordinary capacity for perceiving unconscious contents in others, and that this faculty caused them considerable distress rather than advantage. Think about what that means. The gift that should have made them powerful made them suffer instead. And the reason is something Jung called participation mystique, a term he borrowed from the anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, to describe a state in which the psychic boundary between self and other becomes dangerously thin. These individuals did not just observe the emotional atmosphere of their environment. They absorbed it. They became saturated with it. The depression of a parent, the rage of a partner, the quiet desperation of a co-worker. They felt it all as if it were their own. And here is the part that most people never consider. This absorption was not weakness. Jung saw it as a feature of a particular psychological type, one that processed environmental information at a depth most people simply cannot access. Decades after Jung's death, researcher Dr. Elaine Aron independently arrived at a parallel finding through her own clinical work on what she termed highly sensitive persons. Roughly 20% of people, she found, carry this heightened sensory and emotional processing capacity. Her work was not derived from Jung's typology, but the overlap is striking. Where Aron identified the broad, highly sensitive population, Jung had mapped a rarer subset he called the introverted intuitive type, individuals who not only felt more deeply, but perceived the unconscious architecture of other people's inner worlds with a precision that bordered on the uncanny. Consider a composite profile that illustrates this pattern clearly. Imagine someone who spent the first 3 decades of their life functioning as the emotional absorber of every system they entered. A family where conflict was never named, only felt. A relationship where love was offered conditionally, strategically, like currency. A workplace where dysfunction was collective and unspoken. This person said nothing. They absorbed. They adapted. They made themselves smaller to fit the shape of what others needed them to be. But here is what Jung found so disturbing about this kind of profile. The silence was not passivity. It was accumulation. Without consciously intending to, this person had been registering every pattern of manipulation, every emotional trigger, every hidden vulnerability of the people around them. Their psyche, finely tuned by years of hypervigilance, had been mapping the unconscious terrain of everyone in their world with extraordinary precision. They had never acted on that map, not once, until something pushed them past the edge of what they could endure. And this is what Jung found so quietly devastating about these profiles. The accumulation was not a choice. It was not strategy or cold calculation. It was survival. When the people around you are unpredictable, when love arrives with invisible conditions, when reality is regularly rewritten to serve whoever holds the most power in the room, your nervous system learns to pay attention at a level that most people never develop. Every shift in tone carries information. Every contradiction between what someone says and what they do is noted, stored, cross-referenced against everything that came before. The highly intuitive individual is not building leverage. They are simply trying to stay safe. And yet, when the breaking point finally arrives, what they are holding is the most precise and complete picture of the truth they have ever possessed. This is where shadow projection enters the picture, and Jung considered it one of the most dangerous mechanisms in human relationships. Here is how it works. When someone with highly differentiated perception begins to reflect back what they see in others, not aggressively, not even consciously, just by existing authentically in their presence, those others experience something deeply uncomfortable. They see themselves, and most people cannot tolerate that. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. Jung wrote that the person who sees clearly becomes a mirror that society cannot bear to look into. The unconscious mind has exactly 2 responses when it is confronted with its own reflection. It can integrate what it sees, or it can attack the mirror. Most people attack the mirror. This is what Jung called the scapegoat dynamic, a pattern rooted in the psychological process of projecting one's own unacceptable contents onto an outside figure, and then persecuting that figure for carrying them. The highly intuitive individual enters a group, a family, a workplace, a friendship circle, and within weeks or months becomes the designated problem. Not because they created problems, but because their presence made existing problems impossible to ignore. Their mere existence disrupted the unspoken collective agreements about what would never be named, never brought to light. Jung observed how this escalation tends to unfold. It begins with subtle misattribution, accusations that do not match reality, motivations assigned that the perceptive person never held. As those projections meet no confirmation, the projections intensify. The projector's conviction hardens. They stop questioning their perceptions. They begin recruiting others to share their distorted view. Drawing on Jung's extensive writings on collective projection and the scapegoat, analysts have synthesized this process into recognizable stages. initial projection, conviction crystallization, reality distortion, social recruitment, collective possession, and finally, systematic exclusion. By the later stages, the perceptive individual finds themselves surrounded by a shared narrative about who they are, a narrative constructed entirely from someone else's unconscious contents. They are defending against accusations that feel like they came from nowhere. Because they did. They came from the projector's shadow, not from anything the perceptive person actually did. And the most devastating part is this. The perceptive person usually sees it happening. They see every stage of the escalation. They recognize the pattern in real time, and still, for a long time, they say nothing. They absorb, they adapt, they make themselves smaller again. But here is where it gets truly disturbing, because that pattern recognition never stops working. Every day, the psyche is filing away new information. Every manipulation, every rewritten conversation, every gaslit moment, registered. Every trigger, every hidden fear of every person in their environment, noted, stored, never acted upon. Jung observed that the unconscious mind of the highly intuitive individual functions, in this period, as something like an internal archive, a vast accumulation of perceived reality, waiting, not for revenge, for release. And that release always comes. Jung described what triggers it as a confrontation with an undeniable truth, the moment when accumulated perception finally overwhelms the individual's capacity for denial, when the evidence reaches a threshold that the psyche simply cannot argue with anymore. The trigger is almost always betrayal, not a minor betrayal, a profound one, the kind that comes from the person or people the highly intuitive individual trusted most completely. An infidelity, a financial deception, a manipulation so carefully constructed that it reveals, in one shattering moment, that the person they protected never saw them as a person at all. To illustrate the pattern Jung observed in his clinical work, consider a narrative drawn from the kind of composite profile that appeared repeatedly across these cases. We see this dynamic in the story of someone who had, by every external measure, built a life that looked like stability, a career, a long-term relationship, a reputation as the calm and reliable one, the person everyone called when things fell apart. But internally, this individual had been running on empty for years, absorbing the emotional weight of everyone around them, while their own needs went unnamed, unmet, and eventually unfelt. They had convinced themselves that this was simply who they were, steady, selfless, strong. Then came the betrayal, not loud, not dramatic. A quiet discovery, evidence, carefully concealed, that the person they had most fiercely protected had been deceiving them for years. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted, not broke, shifted, like a mechanism finally engaging after years of pressure building behind it. What the people around them expected was emotional chaos, screaming, falling apart, a collapse in the conventional sense, visible, destabilizing, easy to dismiss. What actually happened was the opposite. This person became unnaturally calm. Jung observed this type of response in his clinical documentation and described it as one of the more striking phenomena he encountered. Not rage, not grief, but a sudden crystalline clarity. The individual began to speak the truth. Everything accumulated, registered, and silently endured. Not with cruelty, with precision, naming the pattern, naming the mechanism, naming exactly what had been done and exactly how, with the calm of someone who had been carrying this knowledge for a very long time. This was not revenge. It was something Jung's framework helps us understand clearly. The moment of abaissement had finally arrived, but instead of producing disintegration, it produced the opposite. The lowering of the mental level dissolved the persona, the constructed role, the performed self. and what emerged underneath was the authentic individual, integrated and whole. Jung called this the individuation breakthrough, not a term he used lightly, and not a comfortable experience. He described the dissolution of the persona as one of the most disorienting passages a human being can undergo, precisely because the persona has been mistaken for the self for so long. When it collapses, the person experiences something like a death. The emotional shock absorber, the designated peacekeeper, the mirror everyone wanted to shatter, that constructed identity dissolves. And what remains is something altogether different. The shadow has been integrated, not eliminated. Integration does not mean erasure. It means the previously unconscious material has been acknowledged, owned, and brought into conscious relationship with the whole personality. The capacity for precision that once only mapped danger now maps possibility. The heightened perception that once isolated now serves, because the individual has finally stopped apologizing for what they see. Jung believed this was among the most significant transformations he observed in clinical practice, not because it produced dangerous people, but because it produced people who could no longer be unconsciously manipulated. This is the total collapse that no one talks about, not the breakdown, the breakthrough, the dissolution of the persona, the carefully constructed social mask that had been mistaken for a self. Because here is the truth about persona identification that Jung documented extensively. When someone invests all of their psychic energy in maintaining a role, the helper, the peacemaker, the one who absorbs and adapts and never demands anything in return, they do not just lose contact with their own desires, they lose contact with their own shadow. And that shadow does not disappear. It accumulates like pressure in a sealed system until the system can no longer hold. The collapse is that system releasing, and what comes through is not darkness, it is wholeness. Jung observed individuals through this transformation and documented what their lives looked like on the other side. The results were striking, not because they became harmful, but because they became extraordinarily clear-eyed. Their perception, now integrated with genuine psychological groundedness, made them far more difficult to deceive. They could recognize the early architecture of manipulation. They could see the shape of a dysfunctional dynamic within minutes of entering it. They left harmful situations with strategic clarity, not emotional chaos. They rebuilt on their own terms. And here is the detail Jung found most significant. These transformed individuals did not become cold. They did not become numb. What they developed were what we might call conscious boundaries. And those are entirely different from walls. A wall keeps everything out. A boundary is a threshold you control. You decide what crosses it, when, and on what terms. Jung's observations suggest this distinction between the protective numbness that unprocessed trauma can produce and the conscious selectivity that integration produces is one of the clearest signs that individuation has genuinely occurred. But Jung was not naive about the dangers of this process. He identified several common obstacles in Jungian analysis that could derail even the most genuine integration, ways the process goes wrong and produces rigidity or isolation rather than wholeness. The first is what Jung called psychological inflation. This occurs when the newly integrated individual becomes identified with the contents of the unconscious they have integrated, rather than simply relating to them. They begin to believe they, alone, can see the truth. They begin to appoint themselves as bearers of absolute clarity. Jung considered this one of the most insidious forms of unconscious possession, precisely because it feels like enlightenment from the inside. In his essay on the relations between the ego and the unconscious, he warned explicitly about the individual who mistakes the archetype for the self and inflates accordingly. The moment you believe yourself to be the carrier of absolute truth, you have surrendered the very consciousness you sought to develop. The second obstacle is withdrawal. justified as wisdom. Jung observed individuals who used their expanded perception to rationalize complete disconnection from the world around them. They convinced themselves that others were too unconscious to be worth engaging. That solitude was enlightenment. Jung was unambiguous on this point. True individuation requires sustained engagement with the world, not escape from it. The person who withdraws entirely has not transcended the struggle. They have been overcome by it. The third pattern is the substitution of one persona for another. Some individuals, having shed the role of emotional absorber, simply replace it with the role of healer, guide, or seer, defining themselves entirely through their capacity to perceive and assist others. The inner development that drove the original collapse quietly stops. Jung's warning here cuts to the bone. When any function becomes the whole of a person's identity, the person disappears behind the function. That is not individuation. That is a new performance. The fourth common obstacle is regression under sustained pressure. Even genuinely integrated individuals can be pulled backward during periods of extreme stress or major life upheaval. The old patterns reassert themselves. The old absorption begins again. Jung's framing here was not discouraging. He simply insisted that individuation is not a destination. It is an ongoing process, requiring continuous conscious attention. The work does not end, it deepens. Jung also noted something about timing that most people overlook. The collapse does not always arrive as a single dramatic event. For some, it is a sudden earthquake. For others, it is a slow erosion, a series of small confrontations with truth that accumulate until the old identity has nothing left to stand on. Both arrive at the same place. But the gradual version is harder to recognize, because there is no single moment you can point to and name. Instead, you look back one day and realize that the person you used to be, the one who absorbed without limit, who apologized for existing, who shrank to fit the shape of people who were never grateful for the sacrifice, is simply gone. And you are not mourning them. You are relieved. So what does genuine transformation look like when these obstacles are avoided? Jung described individuation in stages that are both simple to understand and demanding to live. The first is recognition without overwhelm, acknowledging the full weight of your perceptive capacities without being consumed by what you see, not minimizing your awareness, not drowning in it, holding it steadily with open eyes. The second is integration without isolation, bringing that perception into constructive relationship with the world while maintaining genuine human connection, not withdrawing because it is painful to see clearly, but choosing consciously how and when and with whom to engage. The third is service without self-erasure, the moment your perception stops being a burden you carry alone and becomes something you offer from genuine capacity rather than compulsive depletion. Jung was specific. Service driven by fear of disapproval is not service. It is a continuation of the persona. And the fourth is what Jung called the transcendent function, the integration of conscious and unconscious material into something neither contained alone. A way of engaging with the world that carries meaning beyond personal acknowledgement, contributing to collective consciousness without requiring recognition. At this stage, Jung observed, individuals relate to their perceptive capacities lightly. They see clearly without being compelled to fix everything they observe. They perceive deeply without losing themselves in what they perceive. They have become, in the most precise sense of the phrase, conscious participants in their own lives, no longer absorbed by the world around them, but genuinely present to it. This is the transformation that the dissolution of the persona makes possible. This is the trauma no one talks about, not because it is shameful, but because it is profoundly disorienting. Because the culture around us has no real framework for it. We know how to talk about breakdowns. We do not know how to talk about the moment someone becomes psychologically whole. And here is the truth that Jung returned to throughout his career. The people who go through this process do not just transform themselves, they change the systems they belong to. A family that organized itself around one member's unlimited absorption is forced to restructure when that member stops absorbing. A dynamic that depended on one person's silence is forced into the open when that person stops being silent. Jung believed that highly intuitive individuals who completed the individuation process served what he called a culture carrier function, carrying within their own transformation a movement of consciousness that the collective would eventually need to make as well. The most important insight Jung left us on this process is also his most uncomfortable one. Most highly perceptive individuals already possess everything they need for transformation. The awareness is already there. The accumulated understanding is already there. The only thing standing between who they are and who they are capable of becoming is the moment they stop treating their own perception as something to be ashamed of. There is a particular kind of courage required for this. Not the loud courage of confrontation, but the quiet courage of no longer abandoning yourself, of trusting what you perceive when the world has spent years insisting you cannot trust it. Jung observed that this threshold, the decision to honor one's own inner reality, was almost always the final passage before genuine individuation began. The people who crossed it did not become different people. They became more fully themselves than they had ever been permitted to be. Your perception is not the problem. Your unconscious relationship to your perception is the problem. The moment you stop suppressing the clarity you have spent years accumulating is the moment the collapse becomes complete. And the moment the collapse becomes complete is the moment you stop being someone who endures and start being someone who chooses. Jung spent a lifetime mapping the dark territories of the human psyche. He did not do it to produce fear. He did it to produce freedom. Freedom from unconscious manipulation. Freedom from the projection fields of others. Freedom from being recruited again and again into psychological dramas that were never yours to carry. He believed that consciousness itself was the most durable protection available to any human being. Not armor, not distance, not the hardening of the heart, just the capacity to see clearly and to trust what you see, even when everything around you insists that you are wrong. The psychology of total collapse is not the story of someone who fell apart. It is the story of someone who fell together, fully, completely, into themselves. And if you recognize yourself somewhere in what you heard today, then you already know what Jung understood. The breaking point and the breakthrough are not two separate events. They are the same moment. You just have to decide. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.